Welcome. I'm Danae Simmons with the HCI Solution. And as we go through today's educational session, please make sure that you can see the screen and you can hear us clearly. If you start to have any difficulties, please just let us know and we will address that right away. Today's presenter is Dan Collins, our VP of Operations. He has over 2 decades of MEDITECH experience in all platforms, and he is going to share that with us today. And with that, I will turn the educational session over to Dan.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Danae. Today we're going to be covering an advanced report designer topic, creating calculated fields. What we're going to be going over is some writing rules to generate output to calculated fields, setting up custom data in MEDITECH. That custom data allows you to define customer-defined data that will be stored in the MEDITECH database. We're also going to write rules to output customer-defined query responses, and we're going to cover how to layer rules, how to use the output for one rule that can be fed into another rule to further manipulate data. I was kind of skipped to the second slide, but the other things we're gonna cover are. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I didn't. Here we go. Here's the second slide. So the concept of custom data in MEDITECH allows customers to store and reference additional data values along with the standard MAT record. Only records that MEDITECH defines as custom extendable can have custom data associated with it. We'll go over that in a little bit more detail, but basically what that means is that you can't just add custom data to any record in the MEDITECH database. The MEDITECH application databases, the records have to be previously defined to allow it. We do have an HCI knowledge base article that I linked to in this slide deck that goes over, exactly in detail, how all this is set up. Let me see if I can pull that up. Anyway, oh, here it is. Well, I'm having problems linking directly to that knowledge base article, but we'll share this slide deck with all of you after this presentation, and you can take a look at it. But it goes into detail on how the custom data in MEDITECH is structured and how you set it up. But we're also going to go into it a little bit here in this training today. So the way this is set up is that the custom data record will be defined as a child of the standard record with one additional key. The name and tag of the custom data record will be derived from the standard record by prefixing it with !CD. And the name of the additional key will be !CD-query. The value of the additional key will be the customer-defined query mnemonic. So this is a way to take customer-defined queries in a list of queries and add them to a record that's defined in MEDITECH. So you could have a registration account that has a bunch of customer-defined queries attached to the registration that are entered perhaps by the registration clerk when the patient is registered, or you might have a custom data set added to orders. So if there's specific kinds of orders that are entered in the system, you may want to capture some additional data at the time that order is ordered. For instance, like what is the patient's risk of falling? So let's say you're putting in an X-ray order, and the patient might need to be transferred down to the radiology or ITS department. you might want to enter in the patient's likelihood of falling score, something similar to that, something that might be related to the order in helping make clinical decisions. That, being able to add these fields that aren't standard fields in the system, being able to customize your own. Okay, moving on. So this table kind of shows how the custom data is structured alongside a regular record in MEDITECH. Record name would be derived from the name of its parent record. So if there's a custom record defined under the main record, it would be !cd-main. And the record tag is really an internal representation. It's used for storing the record in MEDITECH's databases, but you don't normally see the record tag in Report Designer. I just highlighted here just so you kind of get an understanding of how this data is structured. If let's say that the record has one key, maybe reg account main has one key, it's the patient OID, the patient's object identifier. But if there was a custom data set added to that main record, then that custom record would have the original key plus one additional key. So that custom !cd main would have two keys in it. And the key would be just the query, the customer defined query mnemonic would be that key. So you could really only have, one iteration of that, the same query mnemonic under that main record. And these are just the record key values are just examples here. Like if we were talking about maybe the MIS location dictionary, the record key value for that might be 1 East, might be location mnemonic, but the keys under this custom data set would be the query mnemonics. And we'll show you what that looks like in a bit. And all of these custom data records, regardless of which standard record they're a child of, they'll have the same list of fields. So in the first field will always be the query response, the value, and then the next field, we call this, piece 1 will be the data type, piece 2 will be the whether the query takes multiple response or just a single response. The user that entered the response, and date and time, and then there could be other info associated with the query. The other info is information like I think some examples are like measurements used, like is it metric or English, and that's one example of what the other info can be. And then, of course, custom data queries which have multiple values will have their !cd value field. It will be a list of values. So you have to take that into account when writing your Report Designer reports. If you have to, when you write a rule to include some of these responses, and it's a multiple value, you have to account for that in your rule. Or you have to account for that in the data type of the calculated field that you use. You might have to set the data type of your calculated field to be a list type so that the report knows that and will display the list of responses. If the response is a multiple type query response, that !cd multiple field will be set to yes. So the way you define which query mnemonics are associated to these custom records is in a routine under information systems, MIS, dictionaries, custom defined data, and then there's a routine called record in MAT. And in this routine, we'll show you a screenshot of this routine in a minute, but there's already predefined records in the system. So you basically go into this routine and do a lookup and choose the record that you want to add customer defined queries to. But these responses, the way in Report Designer, the way that you print these queries, the way you print these customer defined queries is through a rule. You have to use a rule to output these queries. And we'll go over that in a bit as well. So this is a screenshot of that MAT record enter edit routine. And you're not able to create new records here. So the only thing that you can do here is add additional queries to a record that's already defined. And these queries, of course, are built in the MIS application. So if you want to be able to, I should say there's different ways to access query responses in the system. There's an object called reg account query values. You can write a rule to pull values from there, but there is some functionality built into Report Designer to allow you to add mnemonics, custom-defined query mnemonics that are added to these custom records. And that's probably the easiest way to pull query responses into your reports. And we'll go over that. We're going to do an example of where we write a report that pulls data from some of these custom records. This is just an example of, this is the MEDITECH's object viewer. This is an example of what some of these custom records look like. So this is a registration account object. And this is a custom record called reg account !cd dash custom data queries. So that means, based on what we just talked about, that the parent record of this record is called custom data queries. And this !cd is a child record of that record. And like we talked about, the first key in that record is all the query mnemonics you can see here. And then the !cd value is all the responses to those queries. And you can see some of these responses are lists. You know, anything that sets a multiple, where the !cd multiple, yes, will be a list. But there's also other data types in MAT, like plain text is a multiple. Like each line of text is a list, and each line of text will be separated by the bar symbol here. So each line is its own list set member. And then you get some other, you know, free text fields that are just a single scalar field here. Other fields like other data types like temperature is a list, and it's always 2 items. It's always centigrade in the first element and Fahrenheit in the second one. But just to give you an idea of how these custom records are organized. And this just shows you, you know, we talked about how all these custom records all have the same fields in the records, and here's just a listing of all the different fields. And this one, I'm not sure why it doesn't have a user, date and time, and other info on this piece of data. So in Report Designer, this is where you define this is how you define the query mnemonics that are attached to those custom records. So in the fields page of Report Designer is where you go in and you do a lookup into the queries, and it'll give you a list of all the queries that are available to you to add to your report. This report here happens to be in order report, so we've added some queries that are associated to the patient's order here. And after you define the query, you have to define the variables that are used for the keys in the record. So this record's parent record has one key, so you have to define, it's the OM ORD OID. So you have to define the key, what variable contains the key value for that OM ORD OID. And we'll go into that a little bit more as we create we add some calculated fields to our report. Once you have the queries defined, then you're able to add them to your rule logic, where you can go into expression, compute, expression. Then you have the query option, where you could select the query type element, and then you get the choice of all the queries that you entered in on the fields page of the report. And when you include these elements in your rule, you're able to output the values of the responses for these customer-defined queries. And the mnemonics for these queries are actually right here. Like this one, the query mnemonic is actually activity 01, and the mnemonic for the second query is aps.wbstat. So we're going to go in and do a live demonstration now. We're going to take one of the reports that we wrote in one of our previous educational sessions, the one that we did for the pulling data from multiple different applications. We wrote a PCS order report. So we're going to take that report and that we built at one of our customers' systems, and we're going to add some calculated fields to it. We're going to use some custom defined records. So let me show you that. Get into the system here. So this is the report we're going to use, PCS HCI int order report. And it's basically, if we look at the layout of the report, this report prints off patients from a certain registration date and time, the patient's intervention, and all of the patient's orders. In this scenario, we're going to pretend, for lack of a better word, that we've been asked to write a report to include the patient's temperature at the time of registration. And in this case, the patient's temperature is stored as a customer-defined query in registration. So I'm going to show you how to write a rule to pull that information. So we're first going to go to the field section of the report, and we're going to create a calculated field. Calculated fields in Report Designer always have to start with lowercase c and then underscore, and then you can give it whatever descriptive name you want here. So we'll call this patient temp. We give it a label called temperature. Before we give it a value, we want, since this is a patient, we're going to be accessing a patient-specific customer-defined query, not in order, not a customer-defined query that's attached to the patient's order. If you notice, this report uses as its detail record the PCS account, int OM order, and the intervention order. So if you look at the with attribute here, it's saying this calculated field will get calculated when we are processing the patient's order. But I want to change that. Since this is a patient-specific field, I want this calculated field to get calculated when we process the patient record. So you can go down to this with attribute and change the record that is associated to this field. So we're going to change this to reg account main. And then we're going to go up to value, delete that, and we're going to create a rule. So I'm going to call my rule pat temp. Oh, I'm going to click on the new button, and I'm going to call this pat temp. And notice that when I go into the record is reg account. I mean, when I go into the rule, the record associated to the rule is reg account main. That's good. That's what I want. If I didn't add the with attribute, and if I didn't add the correct record to that, this would have most likely been the detail record of the report, which is not what I want. So I'm going to create a variable here called return, because we're going to set that as the return value of the rule. And I'm going to go to the field section here, and we're going to go down to the query lookup. I can do a lookup here, and this gives me a lookup to all the customer-defined queries and the data record that they're attached to. Now, this data record is the record that was built in that MAT records routine that we went over earlier. So I want to pull a mnemonic. I want to pull the temperature mnemonic, and I know the one that I want to pull is called VS temp. Let's do a lookup there, and I can see, okay, this is on the reg account data record, and this is the one that we looked at on the screenshot from the MEDITECH object viewer that I showed you earlier. So we're going to select that. Oh. We're going to select this one. And you have to make sure the right key value is defined here. You have to define the key for reg account OID. It defaulted into V0, which is actually the correct one. But if you do a lookup here, you can see that V0, when we come into this rule, V0 is always the first key. In the rule, V1 would be the second key. And so I can see this is reg account OID. So that's the right one there. So then all you need to do now is we have the ability to access the value for that query. Now we have to just tell the rule what to do with it. So we're just going to save that as output. So I'm going to say new expression, compute expression. I can't just say set program result to that query, because all I have here are variable names. I don't have access to the query from set program result. So I have to go under compute expression, and then you can see I have the query choice here. I'll choose query, and then I have all the queries that I defined on that fields page. So there's that vs.temp query. Select that, and I'll save that as the return value. I'll accept that. And this is good enough. The last value of your rule is always the value that's returned by your rule is always the last statement that's executed, the value of the last statement that's executed. But just to be clear, my rules, I usually like to just add a new line that says expression set program result to return. It's not really necessary in this particular case, but it does help when other people are working on your rule after you, or you come back and look at this maybe 6 months later. You know what you had intended for this rule, that it's clear that you intended this rule to return a value, and that value is going to be used outside of this rule. So we'll file that. So now this calculated field, C patient temp, will execute this rule to get the value for itself. And now we just have to place that calculated field on the report. And you can imagine, I'm just pulling a response from a query here, but you could do all sorts of interesting things with calculated fields. And a lot of times with calculated fields, you'll be doing string extraction where you will take, you know, things that are written out in text and parsing that text and returning a value from it. You know, we had one example recently where we worked on a report that had a customer-defined query that had the number of days and the number of hours all like written out. So there was a query response that said 4 days and 4 days, comma, 3 hours, all spelled out like that. But we needed to manipulate that data in our report. So we wrote a calculated field associated to a rule that would take that text and parse out the text of 4 hours and send the 4 to one variable called days, and then send the rest of it, you know, the number of hours, to a separate variable called hours. And then we're able to have those distinct values set up that we can manipulate and do different things with, and to create different outputs for our report. So the next step is to add this calculated field to the report. And then, so then you just go to layout, and I want to add this to the patient section of the report, the patient region. So I just go to auto format. We'll do horizontal with labels, and it just stuck the patient temperature down here. And I'll click and drag to move the patient temperature up to create more space for this. So in order to add another row up here, I have to click on Show Rows and select that top row and drag and drop it down. And then I have another row there to work with. So we'll say temperature here, and we'll move the patient temperature here. And we'll run this report and see what we get. Here, let's clean up some of these blank rows here. We'll do create. If you click the create button, it just saves the report and translates the report into new object code. It's the same thing as clicking on Save Final, but we don't have to exit editing the report when we click on Create. So I'm going to click on Run, and I'm going to run this for November 15th through November 15th, because I know we have some good, this is a test system, so I know we have some good examples in there. What did I do wrong? Oh, I think I chose the wrong facility. WMI is what I want. Okay, so the first patient here doesn't have any values under temperature. The second patient here did, but this is interesting if you look at it. So our rule is working, it's outputting the temperature, but I think if you remember earlier, I said the temperature data type always has Celsius as the first element and Fahrenheit for the second element. So not the most pretty way to display this. So Report Designer, it's doing this because in our calculated field, we just told Report Designer that this is free text. We can easily fix this by going back to the fields page of our report and telling Report Designer that, let's go to this calculated field and telling it, this is not free text. This is in fact the temperature. So you can do a lookup here and select different data types. And if we tell Report Designer that this is a temperature type field, it will do the right thing and it'll convert that to a value that's more readable. So let's do create again. And we'll run the report again to see what we get. Now we can see, okay. Now it's just displaying the temperature in Fahrenheit, which is good. And I think there must be some parameter or something that says that, you know, what the hospital is using, or using Fahrenheit or Celsius, and it will just use the correct unit. Now, let's say to do something a little bit more advanced, let's say that we've been asked to display the temperature in both Fahrenheit and in Celsius for some reason, but you know, let's say that's what the customer wants. They want that both the units to display on the report. So what we're going to do is we're going to write another rule that will take that temperature and you know, manipulate it. So one of the things that we wanted to cover today is using the output from one rule and feed that into another rule. So we're going to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to go under this pat temp rule. And what we're going to do is save the output from the temperature. We're going to save that to an external variable. An external variable in Report Designer, similar to calculated fields, how they always start with a lowercase c and an underscore, external variables always start with a lowercase e and an underscore, and then a description of what you want to call this variable. We'll call it pat temp. And we'll say, yes, this is external. And we'll go to our rule, and I'm going to add a line in here. I'm just going to say compute expression. We're going to say variable return and save that to epat temp. So we're just saving off the value from that query, the query response to epat temp. And that's going to contain a list of both Fahrenheit and both Celsius and Fahrenheit. And I'm going to use this rule and that other calculated field just to calculate the value of epat temp. So I'm no longer going to display this field on the report. And I'll explain that in a minute. So, but what I want to do is I'm going to edit the return value to just return nil, to not return a value. So all this rule now is doing is setting up epat temp, and then we're going to create another rule that's going to manipulate that list of data. I'll show you that. So we'll file this. And so I'm going to create a new calculated field called cpat temp version 2. And again, we're going to change, we're going to keep that as free text. And again, I'm going to change the record that's associated to this calculated field. And we're going to create a new rule. We're going to say format temp. Oh, I always want to type in the new name there and click new. Maybe someday MEDITECH will allow you to type in the name there and then just click new. I always forget you have to click new first and then give it the rule name, the rule mnemonic in the rule. And then what we want to do is enter in our external variable that we created in the other rule. And you can, with external variables, you can access them between rules. All you have to do is, unfortunately, you don't get a lookup here. You know, it would be pretty neat if you could do a lookup into all the other rules that are associated to your report and, you know, select an external variable from your other rule, but you just have to make sure you give it the same name as the rule and as the external variable in the other rule and say yes to external. So we're going to go to the rule. Oh, let me create a return value for return variable for this rule. I'm going to create a couple of other variables. I'm going to call it like Cell for Celsius and FH for Fahrenheit. And so what this rule is going to do is it's going to take that list of Celsius and Fahrenheit values and just combine them into a string, combine them into text that says whatever the temperature is, Celsius / whatever the temperature is in Fahrenheit, and then we're going to list a, you know, uppercase F after that. So you'll see that in a minute. So what we're going to do is go to our rule logic. We're going to say new. We're going to say we're going to first break out the Fahrenheit and Celsius values from that list. And the way we do that is we say expression, compute. We're going to take our external variable and we're going to use our offset operator. Use the offset operator to get specific items in a list. I'll show you that. So we're going to say epat temp offset, and then we're going to enter in a number 0. And all that means is give me the first item in this list and save it to a variable called cell, C-E-L for Celsius. And then you could probably guess, but for our next line, we're going to do the same thing, but get the second item in the list. So again, we're going to look at that epat temp variable that contains that list, and we're going to say our offset operator number 1. So that will take the second item in that list, which is the Fahrenheit temperature. We're going to save that as Fahrenheit variable. And then now that you have those broken apart, parsed out into separate variables, you know, we're going to create the string that we want returned by this rule. So we'll say new string manipulation, and we'll do the join function. Join is just the concatenation. It just means take this value and combine it with this value, combine it with this value, combine a bunch of values together, and you can combine strings and numbers and variables. So we'll do that now. So we'll first say join variable. The first thing we want is the Celsius value, and we're going to join that to some free text, and all we're going to say is C for Celsius. I could spell it out, say like Celsius here, but I'm just going to say C for Celsius, Oh, but you know what? I need to also add, I want to add the slash to separate the Celsius from the Fahrenheit. So slash, and then the next item in this string, I want to be the variable for the value for Fahrenheit. So we'll do variable FH for Fahrenheit. And then after that, we'll want to put the unit indicator of Fahrenheit, F for free text for Fahrenheit. And we're going to save that as our return value. Accept that. And then again, doesn't really make a difference functionally here, but we're going to say set program result to return. So in this rule, we're taking the value that was set up by the previous rule, and we're manipulating that data and creating something new out of it that we're going to print on our report. So file that. You know, in this case, free text is correct. That's what we want. Length is 20, you know, that should be fine. We might want to, we still have to include the other calculated field on our report, patient temp, because this rule will not get executed if the field is not on our report. There's other areas we could have set this up, called this this temperature rule from, instead of the field, you can add rules to the regions section of the report. You can add rules to the row record print logic. But since we added this rule to a field, that field has to be included on the report in order for that rule to get executed. So I might just want to take the length down. Well, this has to be, for temperature, it defaults the length to 10. I'm going to change this to free text. So I'm just going to give it one character on the report. Because don't forget, we changed the value, we changed this rule to return a value of nil. So it's not actually going to print anything on the report. All it's going to do is set up the temperature list in that external variable. So let's get over here. So you can see now this temperature is changed to one character. And I'm just going to move it over here. You won't even see it, won't print on the report, but it's just there to execute the logic. And then we're going to add our other calculated field. Patient temperature 2. I'm going to stick that there. I'm going to file that and run this report and see what we get. So you can see the first patient. I don't know what happened to our label. Our temperature label got cut off here. I'm not sure why. You know, that might be coming. That's interesting. It might be coming from the field that we changed to one character. So it's only doing one character for the label too. That's funny. I've never noticed that before, but we can fix that. In this first patient, it doesn't have, the patient didn't have a temperature. So in our second rule, we're manipulating the value of that temperature, which was nothing, and we're adding that C/F to it. So we could just add logic to our rule that says, you know, if E, you know, pat temp does not have a value, then don't set up this C/F. Now we'll take care of that problem. But as you can see, now we're doing what is expected, and we're including both the Celsius and Fahrenheit temperatures on this report. Calculated fields are great for doing things that are not included in a standard data field. Anytime you want to manipulate data from a standard field, or anytime you want to access customer-defined queries, you can use that, use a calculated field. So that's interesting about the label. I think this label is still associated to that other field. Let's delete that label and oops, add a new label. You can just go and add any label you want. So we'll go and put that label up there. Just want to see if that fixes the problem. Get rid of that blank line. Create. And there's one last thing I wanted to show you after this. So yeah, that fixes our temperature label. The other way you can stack rules so that, you know, if you want one rule to, the output of one rule to be used as the input of another rule is in the region section of the report. A lot of times, like you'll add a rule to the detail section of the report, but you can stack rules here where you could say on entry, you can add a rule here. I'm just going to add any rule, it doesn't matter. I just want to show you what this would look like. Then you can add another rule below that one that says on entry, and then another rule. So what happens is this rule gets executed first, always, and then this second rule will get executed after that. So if you want to break up your code a little bit and not have this one giant rule that does everything, you could have smaller bits of code in each rule where you could, in the first rule, you populate some external variables and then you use those external variables in your second rule and they can build off of each other. You could even do, as the first attribute, you could say, what I've done a lot too is print condition as your first one. So you can have your first attribute be a print condition. And if this rule evaluates out to true, then you'll print the detail section of the report and you will execute all the rules below this on the print on entry. But if this rule evaluated out to nil, you would not print the detail record on the report, and you would also not execute all these other rules. So it could be an efficiency thing where you could have all this logic and all these other rules that take up some time in processing and calculating, but you can set up a print condition so that those rules are not executed if your condition evaluates out to nil. Let me get back to the slide deck. That's pretty much it. Does anybody have any questions? We are continuing to add additional educational sessions on our website, the hcisolution.com. So check out the website /webinars and continue to sign up for additional educational sessions that we offer. And thank you all for coming today. And today, I'm not sure if you had anything else you wanted to add.
Sure. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We will be sending out that PowerPoint to everyone who attended today. And if you need anything from us, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you and have a wonderful day.